Today I just want to walk through how I upgraded my old box joint jig to this new one. They're relatively similar. However, I work in an outdoor shop, and one of the problems is that over time this will expand and contract just slightly. The expansion and contraction can mean that one day I'll come in and my box joints may be a little too loose, another day they may be a little too tight. And I got tired of constantly having to screw this in and out and just burning through this piece of MDF. So I decided to upgrade to an adjustable system using just T-bolts and star knobs. The total materials used for this was a sheet of 3/4 inch MDF, a sheet of 1/2 inch MDF, 2 T-bolts, 2 star knobs. You can make these yourself if you want, and 1 piece of miter bar. However, this can also be homemade. So in a sense, really just 3/4 MDF, 1/2 inch MDF. You could also use the 3/4 for this as well, and then 2 bolts. So this can be made for very cheap. I just happen to have some of this hardware laying around, so I used it for this as well. And the benefit of this is that if the humidity changes at all, we can scoot this over at any time we want without having to drill in here, which just makes it a lot cleaner. And the less screws you have to put in here, the less little kind of pressure divots you'll get. So we'll walk through this, and this is very simple. This is the most basic box joint jig you can imagine. The T-bolts I use for this and the star knobs are the PowerTech brand on Amazon, and I believe for 20 of each it was about $30 total, so very reasonable, and these can be used in an unbelievable amount of jigs. With the thickness of the one here, I use 3.5, I believe these are, inch T-bolt bits. Now you can see they still stick out quite a ways, so you could get away with using something shorter. However, you need to make sure that you can get through essentially the 2 inches of the MDF glued together. And the reason we glue this together is just to have a much more stable, thicker, heavier jig overall to increase stability. On this old system, you can see over the years I've adjusted it many times, right? All of these, all over the time. As I've gotten new router bits, things have changed. If you get a new 1/4 inch router bit and you've been using your old one for a very long time, it's going to be a little thicker. So I said to myself, why am I just continuously screwing these in? I'm just going to make a way to move this. So we're essentially going to build an identical version to this, but simply add this upgraded modification to it. Now, I'm going to be doing this for my Craig benchtop router table. It's not the biggest, but what I really like about using MDF is that it's heavy, and that's why I like 3/4 MDF, as well as it is always flat, as long as you don't get it wet. It's also significantly cheaper than 3/4 inch plywood. However, one thing to take note of, depending upon what you're using this on router-wise, is how far up your bit can come. If you get a straight bit in there or a spiral bit, and it's not long enough, your collet will not clear this piece of MDF. Now, we'll go over a little more dealing with that later, but when I very early on had a shorter bit, I had to route a second groove in here, a deeper one, to make room for the collet to just slowly clear. So if you have a very short bit, 3/4 may be too much. You may have to move down to a 1/2 inch, which is okay. I just like a little extra heft to reduce vibration. So just take that in mind, or if need be, buy a longer router bit with a higher cutting height. Now, a lot of people prefer to push their box joint jig over the top. However, I like to pull. I find this easier to be able to see whether the board is perfectly flat and lined up. When I'm going over the top, I can't really see without putting my face way down in there. So this is going to be entirely personal choice as to which way you do your jig, whether you want to push or pull. I also like to clamp my boards on there too. Now, flipping it to pull presents a slight bit of a problem in that you're going to have your clamps either sticking out either way. So you'll have to think about whether you want to clamp or not. I've just found at times that certain woods can pull away a little bit as you're going through, and you'll ruin a project if you get any little bit of movement as you're going over there. So for these purposes, just remember that everything will be shifted to the right side because I like to pull my jigs towards me. So when we're looking at the size, this table itself is a little under 16 inches. This piece right here is about 15. I didn't want it hanging over the sides at all. So that's a good size for me. So I'm going to keep that width. The length on this is about 11. I think I'm going to go to 12. But one thing you have to keep in mind if you are pulling is how far this is going to go forward. If you were to make this the length of this entire table, you would obviously not be able to pull into you because you would get hit in the stomach. If you're going the other way, you can make it longer going forwards. I just personally feel that anytime you can add weight to this, the better. It cuts down on vibrations. It just is more solid. So just take note of which way you're going to go and try to maximize how big of a base plate you can use. Now, as you mill up your base plate, it's very important to have it square to itself. This is another reason why MDF is great. Factory cut plywood as well, is it's going to come with at least one straight edge on it, allowing you to reference for everything else. Because when we connect this, we're going to be using a square to keep this straight to the table and to this miter slot, so that when we pull through, we're going in a direct straight line and not at an angle through our box. So make sure you are able to get this squared up and really check it to make sure ahead of time. Now for the placement of this, plan ahead as to where your bit is going to line up. Now I'm going to put mine roughly evenly across either side with maybe 3/32 of room on the other side, and I'm just going to make a rough mark ahead of time as to where my bit is going to go, so that I know when I place my fence how much room I will have here and where to line it up. As we're going to go through, it's going to be key to make sure that everything remains square, so that when this goes through, everything lines up. Now I'm personally going to use the miter slot for this. A lot of my boxes are relatively big, and the bigger this is, the larger pieces of wood you can fit out to the side. On things like the Rockler's basic box joint jig, it's very tiny. That's the reason I ended up building mine instead of buying theirs. They sell a larger one, but it's quite a bit of money, and you can do this with just MDF and some T-bolts or screws. So make sure that as we're preparing here, we know where we're going to start. Now, since I like to pull forward, I'm going to end up putting my fence somewhere in this area here. So when I come through, I'll be pulling into about there. That will be where my bit stops, and then my wood will be somewhere out in this area, and we're going to come through like so. So I know that when I want to attach this, attach the fence to this, I want to put it a little further back. I'm not directly in the middle. We also want to have some room back here if we need for some braces, some 45-degree angle braces. We're now going to be attaching the miter bar to the base of our jig, and we're going to make sure we have 3 dimes. Some T-Track takes nickels, this one doesn't, dimes fit better, and we're going to evenly space them about the size of our bar. Now we're going to want to make sure that since I'm pulling, I want a little more of this bar this way, so that as I go forward I never get it coming out more than where these spacers are. So I'm going to leave it probably here, and you're going to clamp down to where you want your jig to sit. Now I know that I want mine to be hitting right about in the middle here, and then I will then route forward so that I can go back and forward. But a little bit behind the middle, my fence will then go right here. So we've got to make sure this is square to the table such that this is, so that when we put our fence on, we can just reference it off of this edge. And we won't have to play around too much with going back and forth like a crosscut sled would be. So what you want to really try to do is make sure, if you have a miter bar, that you can get 3 holes in there. So you want to line it up such that your holes will all be hit by at least part of this. And depending upon the miter bar, you may not be able to get 3, but if you can get 3, that's great. So we know we've got our 3 holes lined up. Our square is square to the table and clamped down. We're going to go up like this so that we can adjust this way before we go down. If we go down right away, we're going to be stuck to the miter bar. So I want a little bit of overhang on either side. I'm square. My holes are matching. And I'm going to go down. I'm going to hold that there and press for about 30 seconds before we pull it out. Now that we've held this down for about 30 seconds, we're going to slide it out. Slide it by just pulling the miter bar. Don't pull on this. You don't want to knock it off at all. If you've got dimes under there, they may fall out, so make sure to catch them as they go. And we're going to then lift this out of there gently. And this should be, if you used a good adhesive, stuck to there. So at this point now, we're going to just do 3 pilot holes, screw that in, and then we'll go from there. So to lay out our fence, we're going to want to make note of where our router bit is going to be. Just a rough note, go a little oversized, and make sure you're right on there, because eventually we're going to put a groove in here, and this will allow us to know where we want our fence to sit. Now, I didn't make my fence all the way across. You can if you want. I like to be able to put my hands on the side as I pull it. So I'm going to then know roughly where in my fence I'm going to want this bit to go into. So I like to have it a little further off to the right than the left, but it doesn't really matter. So I'll just line this up. Again, I'll make rough marks of where this is going to enter and exit. And then I'm going to trace out lines all the way down this and on here as well. Now that I've got my lines transferred, I'm going to now line this up with where I want. Now I want about 6 inches or so, 6.5 inches in front of this. We want to have room, if need be, to put some bracing back here, so you don't want to take it all the way to the back. But you do want a little room in front here in case you want to use a 2x4 or something very thick that you want to box joint for whatever reason. So give yourself room in front and in back. I generally leave a little more in front because when I'm taking the box joint out, I want to be able to push this back so that the bit will be here, piece of wood will be here, I can pull it up and I can move over. So if we put this too far forward, we run out of room to go back. So about 6.5 inches is what I'm going to go with on this one. So now that I've got this roughly at 6.5 inches, I'm going to take my square, and because I know this is square to this, I know that this will be square to the router bit, and we will then use this to square this up to this table. I'm going to then scoot it off the back, clamp it down, flip it over, and I'm going to put screws through this. Now, make sure you remember where your bit is going to be. Do not put a screw through there. It will destroy your router bit. I would also not put too many too close together in case they bulge out the MDF at all. Make sure you drill a pilot hole for these, or you can bulge the MDF and your piece will not sit flat. As you're screwing this in, you want to make sure this is staying square. So as you put one in, make sure it's still square and check it for each of them. If it gets knocked out of square, the options are either re-drilling or using back braces to force it forward or backwards. Conversely, either pull it backwards or go forwards. So when we drill in the pilot holes, just make sure you are lined up. If you want, you can measure from the front to the back there and then put a line across. But I just generally eyeball it. I know because I've got my markings on the back side that my bit is going to come down here. So obviously I don't want a screw there, but I want one relatively close on the other side, one relatively close on that side, and then we'll go down and one over there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 total. However, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to screw in this one and then double check to make sure that it's still square before I start drilling a bunch of holes. If it's not, then I only have one hole in the thing and I can try again. Much like a crosscut sled, you get a second chance to an extent before you destroy this whole MDF board. Make sure you countersink these so that they're not dragging across your router table. Now that we've got this attached, we're going to want to create our gap for our router bit to run through. So we're going to make sure we're lined up. My lines are a little off from attaching this, so I'm more like here and here. I like to make this wider than the bit itself for a little wiggle room. And we're going to essentially want to find out where we want our bit to be able to come out to. So I'm going to go about to here, and then that is going to be a transfer point where I'm going to drill out this area in between with a drill, using one that's at least large enough that we can get our router bit through there. So I'm going to use a 1/4 inch here. Now, if you're going to be using a very large router bit, you may need to take this plate off, use an edge guide and route it out of there, or use your table or something like that, I'm able to just essentially plunge this through, but with a pre-drilled hole in there, and then slowly raise it and lower it. However, before I do that, on my lift here, I've got a lock and a raising mechanism, and I'm going to create holes so that I can do that while this is in there. So I'm just going to come off to the side, and I know I want my bit to be here. So then I'm going to know that I'm going to stay on that line, and my two holes here are going to be about here and here. Now I'm going to transfer those then to here, and I'm going to drill 2 holes out for that, so that when this is over the bit, I don't have to back it off and pull it off to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and drill these holes out here, one that's at least big enough for the bit to go through. Now the bit is going to spin this way since I'm pulling it, so we're going to want to drill this hole big enough. Alright, now that I've got my holes drilled here, I'm going to place this over into this hole, raise the bit up just about 1/8 of an inch at a time, and go back and forth until I get it to go through here. However, I want to know where to stop, as I don't want to go through this entire thing. You know, take one last chance to make sure your screws are not in the way. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to mark out on my table here how far I want to go forward. Just to about here, so that as I'm pulling it forward, I know where to stop. And after the first pass, we'll check how far back we went, and if we need to go a little more forward, we can do that. Now I'm about ready to make my last pass here, and I'm only going to go a little bit of a ways, maybe half the bit into the back of this, as when we initially line up our front plate, we'll then go all the way back through. Over time, this tends to, due to overpulls, keep going back further and further, and we don't want to go too deep in there initially and weaken this at all before we get this front piece put on. So we're now all the way through the top. If you've done this correctly and lined these up, you should have room so that you can pull your bit over and also raise these and lower these, because eventually when you're lining this up, you need to be able to match the height easily. Now another thing to pay attention to is how big your crank is and how far away it is from here. So I suggest measuring ahead of time to make sure you can clear that, or conversely, you could make this a longer line. You could cut this out longer here so that you can really be anywhere along there. It all depends on you and how many holes you want to put in this thing. So now that I've got this through here, I'm noticing that I'm going to need to add essentially a little room underneath, because when I raise the bit this high to get only over about 1/2 inch of wood, it's starting to push this up. Take this off of there, and then we will route out a wider groove underneath. So the reason we're going to route out a little extra here is because on a lot of bits, your cutting height on this may not be long enough, and this little tip of the bit, or if this is very short, your collet may need to go up into this a little bit for you to get the full height. So in this case, I know that this is long enough for 3/4 inch wood or a little bigger going through this. So I only have to worry about this part here. Now this is about 1/2 inch wide, but I'm just going to use a 3/4 bit and go through this down to about 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 inch or so into this to provide room for that to go all the way through. I'm going to use an edge guide for this because I figured it was easier to see. And I'm just going to plunge down here. I'm not going to go all the way to the top. And I'm going to go back till I'm about halfway or a little over halfway through my fence. Because as I'm going through wood, I want room to go a little past that over time. But we're not going to go all the way through the back. We shouldn't really want to go all the way through our fence either. Just a little bit back into about halfway of your fence. Okay, I finished up cutting this recess in here. I went to about 5/16 of an inch deep, and I double checked that when I put my bit through, that allowed me to get a full inch of height on the other side, which is the full cutting length of this, plus just a little spare room. So depending upon the router bit you have, you may or may not need to do this. They sell some very long cutting height router bits, Or conversely, if it's very short, you may have to go all the way through this so that your collet even can start coming up into there. It all depends on what you're working with here. This is just a basic white side spiral upcut bit, which I find to be the best type of bit for box joints. So I generally just buy this identical bit every time I need to replace it. Now that we've got this all the way drilled through, we're going to now attach this front plate here. Again, I'm using T-bolts through slots in the back. And we're going to line this up such that we can measure to see how far, if we need to drill these out in the back more, to make sure we can go over enough. Because eventually what you do is you drill, or you push the bit through once, you cut a piece of wood that's identical to that slot, put it in there, and then slide it over and use the other piece as a spacer. So you want to make sure that this can move enough so that if you're using a 1/4 inch bit, you can get a 1/4 inch spacer in between where your hole is going to be drilled here and where it's going to go over. Now before we cut this spacer groove, we need to discuss how high it's going to be. And this is going to depend on what your average workpiece is intended to be on this box joint. Now for me, I'm usually using things that are 5/8, 1/2 inch or over. So I'm going to cut mine probably to about a 1/2 inch, maybe a hair under, because it gives me more reference surface when I'm putting the next thing over the spacer. And if you were to go super high, you would not be able to get certain woods through there. So you have to kind of determine ahead of time what you plan to use this for, or at least the smallest size you plan to use this for, because your spacer can be no taller than the wood you plan to use. Because the way we line up a box joint is we take the piece of wood we're supposed to use. This is a little under a 1/4 inch piece of cherry, and we essentially just have our bit slightly over it, because we don't want to go too deep. As we're matching these together, we don't need the fingers to stick out a ton. So obviously then, if you're using a significantly thicker piece of wood, you're going to have to go up much higher, right? So therefore, if you drill this, or if you route this groove super high and put a super high piece in there, let's say you put something that high in there, you'll no longer be able to use thin wood, because you will then be putting a finger this long in there, whereas your mating piece is only going to be this thick, so your finger only needs to be about the thickness of this. So consider your minimum size, and this is also a great reason to have more than one faceplate, because you could route one that's very tiny if you're using 1/4 inch wood, or you could route one that's very big if you're using 8/4 inch wood all the time. So these replaceable faceplates are a great idea to have multiple options. I do this with my finger joint jigs. I have one here that is intended for thicker wood, and you can see the height of this. So it's intended for thicker pieces. This is for my table saw. However, I also have a separate one that's very tiny that I use for 1/4 inch plywood, which we all know is not even a 1/4 inch thick. So this allows me on this one to replace it and use it as a 1/4 inch plywood one for storage stuff. And if I were to use this for tall things, it would still work, but there is next to no reference surface there for me to hold this on. It's very tiny, very tiny. So just determine, if you're only going to make one faceplate, what the minimum size wood you plan to use is. I'm just going to go to about a 1/2 inch and stop there. And if I need to, I'll make other faceplates for smaller things. As we discussed before, we're going to offset this to the left, if you're facing it to the left, because we're gonna cut a hole, and we're gonna move it over with the spacer in between. And so we're gonna put this about a 1/2 inch off to the left, a little over a 1/2 inch if we're using a 1/4 inch bit, a little over 2 times your bit's diameter. The reason I say to make this a little over 2 times the diameter of your router bit is that wood expands and contracts, as we all know, especially if you have an outdoor shop. That includes the little spacer bit. There may be very humid times of the year where this has swollen just a little bit, such that you need to tap this over a little bit to now get the spacing on your box joints correct. This is another reason to use the most stable wood you can. This is a piece from a 1/4 sawn piece here. So I'm going to get minimal movement on this, but still I want to go a little extra over a 1/2 inch so that if I need to, I can push it to the right as well. And I'm going to lock it in. We're a little over a 1/2 inch. And then I will go ahead and make my cut through with this taken down for me to a little under a 1/2 inch or right at a 1/2 inch or so. Set your faceplate off to the left by about a 1/2 inch. That way, if you're using a 1/4 inch router bit, it will be twice the size of whatever your router bit is, roughly. A 1/2 inch bit, you'll want to be at least an inch over, and for any bit given. So then we'll put our hole there. This will move over a 1/2 inch, essentially, our bit and our spacer. Because when you cut a box joint, your initial piece, which I call the over piece, the one with the finger on top, sits up against here. And this is the spacer to make sure this is the piece that's left. The reason we build this adjustable system is because loosening and tightening this needs to be done with a little adjustment, a hair this way, a hair that way, so that when these fit together, they are relatively tight to get in there and you get a nice fit. You don't want them super loose and you don't want them super tight. So we need the ability to adjust. Okay, so now I've made my first cut. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take this faceplate off, and this is where we're gonna make our spacer. And before I got a planer, I just did this on the table saw. I would just rip down a piece of wood, length and height, or width and height, and keep going until I got the correct one. It's not bad to use a test piece. If you're using, you know, a very nice, expensive piece of exotic wood, use a test piece of some type. And what we're looking for is a snug press fit. You don't want to have to smash it in there, but it needs to hold itself in there. You want this to be the width of your router bit. You don't want it to be any less. If your piece can move left and right at all, that's going to be a big problem. So keep cutting pieces until you get a very snug fit. And I'll show you how to do this on the table saw now. Now, before we start making our test pieces, there are a few things to consider. If you've used MDF or even you know, a cheaper plywood, you don't want to be shoving a million things in and out of this, or you will slowly press that space over. So it's not a bad idea to make a test cut in another piece of MDF or the plywood to have as your fitter. Obviously, I know the exact size I'm going for in the end, so I'm not too concerned about that. But if you're doing this for the first time, don't keep sticking a million things in and out of here that are too tight, or you will expand it. We will eventually be gluing the piece into just this front piece as well. So you don't want it so tight that you have to mount it in there, not only because you could deform this, but because we also need to fit some glue in there. Now, when we consider the way we want to cut this out of the wood, I would suggest using nothing softer than soft maple, which is still relatively hard, but a white oak. I would not use cherry or walnut. I have in the past found that they wear down much quicker. So soft maple at the minimum, preferably oak, red oak, white oak, or an exotic, or hard maple if you have a piece. We're also going to want to consider how we cut this out of the board. Now, if you have something quarter sawn, that's great, but we know wood expands this way. So we essentially want to make sure that we are going up like this, so that any expansion is this way instead of this way. So we want to cut a piece off of here that has enough this way for our height, because then we will then flip it over and rip it to width this way. So just make sure to pay attention that you're not cutting your piece where it will expand across the width. You have an outdoor shop. A little bit of humidity can make this a very problematic fit. However, the adjustable nature of the jig will help. If you are just screwing your plate in, though, it can be a big problem. Now, when we do this rip, we really want this piece of wood to stay at 90 degrees. We want it to stay up there. So if you happen to have a featherboard or can make your own, this is a great time to do it, to make sure that piece stays up against the fence. Some people will choose to make this cut on the outside and have your exiting piece be what you want. But for things that are like a 1/4 inch, I still do them on the inside so that I can lightly adjust without having to move the featherboard over and over again. So that part is up to you. Now, you know, this would have been across the width, so I've got that turned up now. Now I know from my router bit that we're going to start at a hair over a 1/4 inch and we'll work our way down. You want to put in whatever blade is going to leave the nicest edge. You do not want a really rough edge that's going to have inconsistencies in the quality of the rip here. So I'm just going to put this a hair over a 1/4 inch and we'll make our first cut. Another thing to note while you're ripping this, if you have an insert that's open in the back, I still need to get myself a zero clearance. This can fall through if you're using a very short piece. So make sure you follow it all the way through. If you tip it down, it can go in there. If it does fall in there, just stop. Just stop, turn the saw off, and you can either fish it off or get it off of the ground afterwards. Do not try and stop it from going down there. Just let it go down there. Alright, well it looks like I got it on my first try, but there were a lot of times where I wasn't that lucky. So keep going until you get a nice press fit. You don't want to have to pound it or smash it in there. Just a little wiggling to get it in there, and that's all you really want. We'll then cut this to our height, and then we'll glue it into here. One thing I will suggest too is sometimes when you're doing thin rips, if your fence is not at 90 degrees or you don't hold the push stick, it can sometimes angle one way or the other. So when you're test fitting this in there, make sure you try both sides, or if you have calipers, double check it. But you just want to avoid an angle such that you have kind of an angle down and your spacing is not going to be right. So just double check that. When we are ripping this to height, I would not try to get this exact height because we don't want the piece sticking out the bottom at all and causing our plate to be lifted off. So again, I'd go a hair under this height so that when we stick it in there, it's not pressing out the bottom. If it does press out the bottom, you can just take some sandpaper and rub this down. It's not a big deal, but it's just a bit of an annoyance. So just take that into consideration while you're cutting your height. All right, it looks like I'm just about a hair under. So I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna cut this. We don't want any sticking out the back. So mark where this is gonna go and trim some off of the back here. And then I would suggest, going out a little ways here, probably 3/4 of an inch or so. You really want a lot of reference room there. You can go a little longer, but the longer you go, the more this can then twist. So you don't want to go too far. 3/4 of an inch is generally pretty good. This won't really, the length of this won't matter at all in terms of your piece of wood size. So you can do whatever you want here. You could go even smaller if you want. I don't see much benefit of going smaller. I'd like as much reference surface as I can without risking this bending as I'm pushing into it. You will also want to save the rest of this piece to make a spacer because these will be identical. So don't get rid of this. In fact, it doesn't hurt to cut a couple of these if you get the perfect size, because if you continue buying the same router bit over and over, you will be able to use this same key over and over and you won't have to go through this again. We're now ready to do the initial setup with this jig. What we're going to need is the offcut from this piece, 2 pieces of wood, ideally that are the same thickness and the exact same size. It's generally easier to do it in multiples of your bit size. So if you're using a 1/4 inch bit, use something divisible by a 1/4 inch. So it's not totally necessary. It's just easier that way. And we're going to set this up by putting our cutter right up against this and sliding our key. I call this a key. I think that's generally what it's referred as. And then taking your router with it turned off and spinning it such that the cutting point goes past the key. And you want to just barely be touching it. You don't want to have a ton of room in between, and you don't want to be gouging it out. If you find that it's pulling this back, you are too close. Now, the way this gets set up is that if you need to tighten the spaces, you move to the right. You move the pin away to tighten it, and you move the pin closer to loosen it. So if after your test cut, it's way too tight, just move this by a hair. And what you can do is set up a block and then get a shim. And with this shim, you can slide the shim in there, clamp this down, loosen the plate, remove the shim, and then slide it over to there. That's the easiest way to micro adjust, is using shims. If you're way off, obviously you're going to need a lot of shims, but I wouldn't try to unclamp it and freehand it every time if you're already pretty close. Use shims and a stop block. Now what we're going to want to do, now that we've got this where we think it's roughly correct, we're going to take our pieces, and I think it's really smart to label these. So I'm just going to label this 1 and 1. And that means these two sides will be going up and meeting together. And the reason for this is that as we cut, our first piece will be placed up against this pin for this cut. And I often like to clamp down when I'm doing it, though some people just hold it down. I find that if you get any movement, you're going to ruin your piece. So initial clamp down, and we want to make sure our pin, decide on your box which side you want being the over. So there's going to be an over and an under. So decide ahead of time which one you want, and that will be the one we cut first. And we're going to line it up, push it into our pin, but don't yank it over there. You don't want to bend this. You want it just setting firmly against the pin. And then we're going to clamp this down firmly against the pin, but not smashed over there. We're going to make sure our bit is raised such that we can just barely feel the cutter head, the tip coming over the top. The higher up that is, the more they will slide together, and the further out your fingers will stick, which means more to remove. If it's not over the top, your fingers will be too short, and you'll have to sand off the whole face of the box to get them to meet. So in my opinion, it's better to be too high than too short, because it's easier to just remove some of the ends of the pins than it is to sand down the entire face of the box. So err on the side of being able to feel it a little too high. So we've got this clamped down, and we are going to want the top over near the pin, since we want this to be over. This is our over piece. And it doesn't hurt to label with an O and a U as well, so that you remember when you go to this side. For a bit like this, I generally have it on the highest speed setting, though you can toy around with the highest and the second highest if you want. If you're getting really bad tear out, put a piece of blue tape across the back where the router is exiting, and then put a piece of blue tape on the back up a little higher so that you're not canting it out. That handles tear out pretty well, but your other problem may simply be a dull router bit. So the first thing to try is blue tape. If that doesn't work, it's probably a dull router bit. You either need to clean it or replace it. And we're going to now turn the router on and make our first cut. As you're making your first cut, just pull until it's just, gone through the wood. You don't want to start putting a huge hole in this yet. It will grow over time, but we want to keep our faceplate essentially as a zero clearance plate so that we do minimize tear out. So you see I've only gone in about 75% of the bit. You obviously need the thickest part of the bit to go through, but minimal tear out there with zero clearance. And over time, you will start pulling it a little more forward and forward accidentally, so it will grow. But from the beginning, there's no need to go further. Now we're going to set our pin, or our piece over our pin, and this is where you get a real good idea real quick whether your pin is correct. You don't want to have to shove it on, but you don't want it to be loose either. It shouldn't be able to freely move, but you shouldn't have to be yanking it off of there. That can be dangerous. So again, personally, I clamp each time, but plenty of people just hold it. I think if you are going to just hold it, I think it's easier to go from the other way. I think it's very hard to hold it this way. I've just always preferred this pull method. And then so we're going to go through and we're going to do this side. And then when we take to go to the next side, we've got 1 and 1 up and over there. So on the next side, we're going to remove this top first, right? So you'll take your box, hold it like this, flip it around so that you've got your overside on your right. Going to go boom. So we're using this pin as our spacer now. And you'll want to put these up there. And you don't want to be like ramming these together. They just need to sit nicely so that your gap essentially should roughly disappear here. If you've got a big gap, these are probably not square. A little bit of a gap is not a huge deal, but you don't want to be able to see a lot of daylight through there. That's how we line up our other side. So I'm going to just go through and cut the rest of these. I'll cut this one first, then that, and see how they look. All right, so I've just finished cutting these joints, and I'm actually pretty thrilled with the fit. So again, minor pressure, but still able to be done by hand. When you put glue in these, they swell. It gets very hard to put them together if they're too tight. Even with a lot of clamping force, you have to go very quickly before your glue starts to tack. So I would really advise against making them extremely tight, except in one case. There are some people who, instead of putting wood glue in each of these, they make them very tight, mallet them together, and then use the very thin CA glue and essentially let it, wick its way down in there. So that would be the only situation in which I would say to go ahead and make them quite tight to the point where you have to mallet them together, is if you plan to wick CA glue in there. Otherwise, if you have to do wood glue, which is what I do, it takes time to put wood glue between each of these joints, which means that the beginning starts to tack by the time you get to the end, and you have to use a lot of clamping pressure to get them together. Now, one thing I will say about this jig, and this is something I hope to work on in the future, is you get dust issues, not just necessarily with dust going flying, but dust will build up here. And if you're like me and you wear a face mask, you can't just blow it away. So sometimes I have to stop and use compressed air to blow it out of there. In the future, I'm going to try to work on a way to put a vacuum hose on the back or something similar to that, or directly underneath to try to pull it down and out. It's a problem I've never been able to solve by just kind of figuring anything out without putting some real effort into it. So if I figure that out in the future, I will put up a video of that. One thing I will say just one more time is, if you need to make your box joints tighter, move the pin to the right, away from the bit. If you need to make them looser, scoot it in a little bit. And we're talking generally like a paper width here. Nothing significant usually, unless you're way off, but you should be pretty close with your key, which is why we save the off cut from this. Now, eventually this will start to get worn down a little bit unless you use some extremely hard exotic. And when that time comes, I usually just cut this off, flush it up, and then flip this over and reuse this same board. And sometimes I'll just even scoot it over and get a couple uses out of this. So, I hope this helps you out. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I think this is going to be a lot of fun to use with the easily adjustable. Thanks.